The patient's vital signs were depicted on the medical equipment. The beeping of the pulse indicator was carried throughout the medical office. A young sick guy was lying on a hospital bed where a breathing mask was attached to his face. This person was a young youth named Fan Xian. The patient was diagnosed with myasthenia gravis. He was a good man but completely useless. Opening his eyes, he looked around the ward. An elderly nurse was collecting medical instruments in a box and was about to leave the ward. It seemed to the guy that he had already died, so he was also a virgin. Fan Xian was very upset. Besides, contrary to his expectations, there was not a nice nurse next to him, but this elderly woman. He slowly closed his eyes. His life really was a dull piece of feces. Slowly opening his eyes, the guy saw some mercenaries looking like ninjas in front of him. When he opened his eyes completely, he was very surprised. Fan Xian's adult boyfriend was in the body of a baby. Wait a minute. Seeing a man in a black blindfold and dark military attire, he was even more surprised. Fan Xian didn't understand what was going on here at all. Even his hair stood on end from Theshik. This man with a black blindfold was moving swiftly through the dark night forest like a real warrior. He was followed by a bunch of black-robed mercenaries who were slightly behind. On top of everything else, this man with a black blindfold had a wicker wooden basket in which just the same Fan Xian was lying in the body of a baby. This man threw a basket into the sky. He himself at this time took his sharp sword in his hands and was ready to attack. The hilt of the sword lit up with a bright blue light. The mercenaries practically attacked him. This blindfolded man was Fanju Kaimu's servant named Wu Shu. The sword completely lit up with a bright blue light. Baby Fan Xian, wrapped in a blue sheet, was lying in a basket. Being in the sky at this time, Fan Xian was all disheveled from shock. Cold sweat was pouring down his face. He opened his mouth in horror, thinking that death was about to overtake him again. At this the same man with a black blindfold named Wu Ju dealt with a bunch of mercenaries, wounding them with his sharp sword, which was filled with bright blue energy. Fan Xian touched his chubby cheeks with his small hands. The realization came to him that he had opened his eyes and discovered that he was at that time in a bamboo wicker basket in the form of a baby. The basket fell right into Mr. Wu Ju's hands. He examined a bunch of wounded mercenaries and relaxed a little, realizing that he was able to deal with everyone. Fan Xian concluded that he had retained all his memories of the modern world. And here he was surrounded everywhere by assassins and black robes. Fan Xian pressed his small lips together and looked at Wu Ju. He also concluded that this man with a black blindfold who was protecting Thebaby was very strong. There was admiration in his brown eyes. Footsteps were heard behind this man. He turned around holding the basket with the baby Fan Xian with his hand. There were 5 more assassins in front of him. They in strange robes made of bones, and even with a staff on the end of which was a human skull, attacked Wu Ju, wishing him death. He dealt with a bunch of blue-robed assassins with just one blow of his sharp sword with bright blue energy. Fan Xian opened his mouth in horror. A man with a staff on which a human skull was adorned was hit by an arrow. It pierced through his neck, releasing drops of red liquid. The killer dropped dead. However, for prevention, he was shot with a couple more arrows. The shooters were black knights in iron armor, denim and rest in expensive clothes and jewelry, drove up on a metal stroller with an intricate pattern. This man was the head of the Nanman prosecutor's office, Namechin Pingping. He said that they underestimated this man with the staff on which there was a human skull, who was a magician who came from the West. He also said that before strong magic, anything would be like a pen that some minister wrote with. He meant that all these manipulations would be completely useless. Chen Pingping then looked at Wu Ju's servant with all seriousness and asked about the baby's sister. Pursing his lips slightly, Wu Ju said that he didn't have time to pick her up either. He then said that he would very much like Mr. Chen Pingping to explain everything to he frowned at the bridge of his nose and sternly looked at Wu Ju. Then he asked if he was the child of the man he had in mind. The man with a black blindfold answered positively. Then the head of the Nanman prosecutor's office asked if the baby was alive. The man also briefly agreed. Wu Ju's servant turned on his heel and walked away. Chen Pingping asked the man where he should deliver the baby Fan Xian, to which he sternly replied that he had to take the boy to a safe place. Chen Pingping pierced Wu Ju's figure with his cold gaze. He said that he had recently returned back, and in his opinion the capital was the most suitable safe place. To which Wu Ju's servant sternly cut off the words that he did not believe the gentleman who was served by the head of the Nandan prosecutor's office. Chen Pingping has slightly rolled his eyes and asked what Wu Zu could give this child, since this man with a black blindfold named Wu Zu was blind. According to Chen Pingping, even if Ju's kung fu was the best skill in the world, home to perfection, but all this man could do was kill. Wu Ju's servant briefly applied to him that he was as crippled as Chen Pingping himself. From such words, the man sitting on the wheelchair gripped her handrail tightly with his hand that Evan's knuckles turned white. Wu Ju stopped. Chen Pingping relaxed his arm. He then reported that he knew a good and suitable safe place where Wu Ju could get new identity and the serene life together with the baby. He turned slightly and asked what kind of place it was. Chen Pingping briefly replied that it was a city called Danju. Some time later, Wu Ju arrived at the Danju palace with a bamboo basket containing the baby Fan Xian. Several years have passed. The months passed quickly enough. In the spring, with the cranes flying by. In winter, when the snow was falling. In autumn, when the dry orange leaves fell. The seasons changed one after another. Group of kids were sitting at the steps off the palace, surrounded by white stone sculptures of Hachi. A boy with brown hair was telling the guys some stories. A blonde girl smiled sweetly and called her brother, telling him that he had told them the story to the very end last time. The little ones were all in attention, clenching their little fists. They were really waiting for the boy to tell them the story to the end. After examining the guys, he told that the story said that the traveler reached the Chinese wall and saw a ladder there. He climbed it slowly, step by step. Then the traveler found a door and entered it. The baby with a baby tooth that had fallen out the day before opened his mouth wide in surprise and asked what happened next. Then the little boy named Fan Xian grinned as he looked at the other guys. What happened then? And then to be continued. People were moving briskly along the street. Someone was just walking and someone was doing all sorts of work. The kids at this time moved to a completely different place from the steps, namely somewhere in the alley where there was a bunch of boards and various abandoned objects. Little Fan Xian stood on a stack of wooden planks, emotionally telling a story. He raised his hands up and smiled, shouting that this was how the hero prevented an enemy invasion. Then he announced that this was the end of the story. From such an emotional outburst, a passing black cat was terribly frightened. Other kids were surprised by the end of the story. They clearly still had a lot of questions. One of the guys was thinking about everything digesting such a story. He even closed his eyes and scratched his forehead. Another kid put his index fingers together in embarrassment, telling Fan Xian that he liked Themener's story more. The little girl with the ponytails raised her hand up and expressed her opinion that it seemed to her that the foggy journey was much more interesting than this story. Fan Xian, who now turns out to be called Fan Xian, waved his hand and pouted, telling the other kids that they didn't understand anything. Then another little girl with a bun on her head came running, shouting to a boy named Fan Xian that he needed to run home as soon as possible since his household manager was beating the maids again. The boy froze, his mouth slightly open. At that time in Danju Prefecture, the same household manager was hitting a blonde maid with a whip. He glared at the girl angrily, swinging again. He told the blonde maid to tell him quickly where the mistress had gone. She trembling all over and trying to cover herself with her hands, her voice lost from fear and beatings, turned to the manager, telling him that the girl really did not know where this lady could go. He hit her again. There were several other maids sitting next to this blonde maid. Next to her was a submissive pink-haired girl with a downcast look from fear. The blonde maid, gradually crawling away from Whip, reported that the same pink-haired maid named Liu Zai should know where the mistress could be, since it was Liu Zai who served the young master. The manager turned his creepy gaze on Liu Zai. She clenched her fists in fear and stammering said that the young master forbade her to talk about the whereabouts of the mistress. The manager clenched the whip in his hand even to the point of trembling. Then he told the maid that if she didn't tell him about it, he would beat her to death. She opened her mouth in horror. There was a strong thought process in the girl's head. The young master was her master whom she had to obey without fail. And the manager is the manager. He had every right to punish maids. It was a terrible, vicious circle. The girl, realizing this, did not know what to do. Then she straight tightened up and said that the manager of the household could beat her to death, expressing her devotion to the young master. The manager opened his mouth in surprise and said that the pink-haired maid was surprisingly very obedient. Then he swung his whip and angrily said that since Liu Zai says so, he can no longer hold back. When the whip hit the maid, Fan Xian's voice was heard sharply stopping the manager. It was really him. Besides, he was also holding the hand of another girl. Apparently this was the little lady. The manager clenched his jaw and muttered through his teeth that if the young lady disappeared, what would the young master do? Then he said that he couldn't teach Fan Xian Allison, but he could teach the maids who couldn't stand the boy. He hit the blonde maid with the whip again. The little lady named Fan Zuo pulled her brother's sleeve slightly, asking the boy to give her the floor since the manager was still a snob and he could explain everything to him. He smiled warmly and stroked the girl's hair, telling her they could not allow her to protect him at all. At this time, the evil manager was also hitting other maids with a whip. This time, Liu Zai also got it. He shouted, asking the maids if they knew what they were guilty of. He asked them if they were thinking about the future of the young master. Continuing to beat the maids, Fan Xian walked past him. The manager again brought the whip behind him, and with eyes sparkling with anger informed the maids that today he would improve their memory. Fan Xian told Tom to stop again. He stood with his feet on a wooden stool. Fan Xian then grinned and waved to Tom, asking the manager to come to him. The latter, holding a whip in his hands, approached. Xian told me to come a little closer. He put his small hands on the man's head, and the man looked at him attentively. The boy told him to keep his head straight. He wanted to ask the little master something but did not have time. Fan Xian took a good swing and slapped the manager hard in the face, even knocking out a tooth. And then, as it turned out, a few more. The man flew away from the boy and rolled head over heels to the side. Fan Xian frowned and asked the manager if he was convinced of his rightness. The manager, terrified and in pain, gradually got up from the ground, lamenting that the young master was doing such atrocities even at such a young age. Then he turned around and shouted through tears to the boy that he would tell his grandmother everything. Sometime later, at an audience with Fan Xian's grandmother, the man smiled guiltily and said that today in the pavilion the young gentleman hit him, thus doing very right. Having lunch with Fan Zuo and Fan Xian, Grandma and was silent, listening attentively. The young gentleman pointed his finger at the manager and told his grandmother that she could see for herself that this very manager had said that the boy had in everything right. Fang Woshuo stood up and said that the manager beat her brother's maids for no reason. Grandma Fan, without interrupting lunch, calmly ordered to change all the maids in the pavilion. Fan Xian, he chewing his wrist, told his grandmother that there was no need for this since the boy liked silence, so there was no need for such a large number of people. Hearing the words of her grandson, she ordered the manager of the household in that case to recall the maids home. He bowed excitedly and was about to leave the room. However, Fan Xian slyly smiled with a full row of teeth and pointed his finger down, whispering to him that they would see if he would dare to mock people. Belonging to Fan Xian again, the manager clenched his teeth in indignation. Then the grandmother closed some dishes with Alad, and said that as soon as they were done the girl would be taken back to the capital in shock. She began to call her grandmother, but she was adamant. Fan Jules Jewel lowered her sad gaze to the table, pursing her lips. The manager chuckled. Fan Xian looked at his sister in frustration. After finishing his meal, he walked down the corridor to his pavilion. On the way he met Lu Zai, who was waiting for him. The boy asked why the pink-haired girl had not yet returned home. The latter, blushing deeply, said that Cease had been sold here as a servant since her parents did not need her. At all, her eyes began to get wet from rolling tears. She said that Cease, except for this place, had no other homemate to go to. Fan Xian raised his eyebrows sadly as he looked at the little maid. Then the boy walked a little further and smiled, telling the maid that they were similar. She asked in surprise. Fan Xian reported that he also had neither father nor mother. The latter, continuing to be more surprised, said that the young gentleman, after all, has a father who lives in the capital. Fan Xian chuckled and told her that she could assume that he was gone. Then he slyly looked at the little girl and said that in that case she could stay here. But after slamming the door, he warned Liu Zai that she should be mentally prepared for the fact that old Manju, apparently the manager, would mock her again. She looked at the closed door in shock. Then the girl smiled shyly, thinking to herself that Cease was ready for anything. At night, Fan Xian lay on his bed and stared at the ceiling. He was thinking about what could be interesting in the capital. He wondered what kind of food Fan Suo usually eats in the capital. The boy frowned at the bridge of his nose and pursed his lips. He was thinking that the food in the capital must be better than the local one. Fan Xian then opened his eyes wide, thinking that he should probably put it out of his mind. He thought it would be better to think about the future than about this. Then the boy rolled over on his side and fell asleep. And at this time a man was sitting on the roof of the roof and watching the boy through the roof window. After twisting around, Fan Xian lay back down again. Then he opened his eyes, on which was directly written "spiritual strength." The boy muttered that he couldn't sleep at all. Then he pushed back his turquoise pillow, lifting it with both hands. The boy giggled, saying that it was finally time to take a look at his precious treasure. This treasure was a yellow, slightly battered, nameless book. The dark-haired boy opened the book, making a strangely adult face with characteristic sunken cheekbones and plump lips. The boy read it with interest, thinking that this book was left to him by the same blind servant named Wu Ju when Fan Xian was very young. Various fighting stands were drawn in the books. The boy immediately realized what it was when he first saw it. It was a kind of chi energy cultivation method. The boy giggled, thinking that hard work compensates for the lack of talent. Fan Xian stretched out his hand, fans holding the book tightly, and looked at here. He thought that even if this method is not good, nothing bad will obviously happen if the boy practices it. There was a thunderstorm over the city of Danja. Lightning flashed brightly in the sky. Fan Xian was sitting alone in the room and enthusiastically reading this yellow-covered book. A man with shoulder-length hair only, whose outline was visible in the dark, was watching the boy. Fan Xian was still reading his book. Bright lightning flashed. The outline of the man behind lit up. He was looking at the kid with bright red eyes. The boy, feeling the movement, opened his eyes wide with horror and looked up from the yellow book. He shifted his gaze slightly back. Behind him stood a tall, white-haired man with a blade on his back. He asked the boy in a creepy voice if he was Fan Xian. The boy silently looked at the book and did not move. Suddenly, a dark-haired boy pounced on a man agitated from shock with hugs. Fan Xian called him father and shouted with joy because he was back. The gray-haired man, whose name turned out to be Feij, raised his eyebrows in surprise and asked the boy again. The young gentleman clung to his arm and started shouting that the white-haired man named Feij was his father. He tried to throw this kid off his arm and shouted back at him that he was not his father. As a result, after all this turmoil, the boy was thrown back with pieces of thick fabric of Faggy's sleeve. Once on the floor, the boy wasn't for a while. and then apologized to his father. He clenched his teeth, pointed a finger at himself, and said what he repeats once again, that he was never his father. After a few moments, Fan Xian made tea and brought a white teapot Fei Jai, offering his father a soothing cup of tea. The gray-haired man sternly looked at the dark-haired boy and said that he was telling him for the last time that he was not his father. Fan Xian looked at the man plaintively with burning tears in his eyes. He sighed and drops of cold sweat slid over his body. Fei Jai agreed to drink some tea. After drinking a little from the spout of the teapot, Jay asked about who made this tea. Fan Xian smiled brightly and said that his mother had prepared it. The man raised his eyebrow 1,000 surprise and said that it was all nonsense since Fan Xian's mother died on his birthday. The boy shouted to the man that his mother was always there. After drinking some more tea, Fei Jai dropped the words that the boy was talking nonsense. Then the white-haired man took a look at his purple robes. The sleeve was badly torn by a boy named Fan Xian. He thought hard, examining the torn sleeve. By the way, the fabric of Fei Zhou's clothes is so strong that it is not easy to scratch it even with a knife. He did not understand at all how a 4-year-old child managed to tear these clothes. Then the man looked at the wall, sipping some more tea. Fan Xian shouted joyfully that his mother had finally come. Hearing these words, Fei Jai's eyes widened in shock. Then he turned towards the door, not believing his eyes. However, it was completely empty, just as the white-haired man though. Suddenly Fan Xian found himself behind a man with some heavy stone turquoise-colored thing in his hands. A tired Fei Jai chuckled, saying that as he thought the appearance of Fan Xian's mother was impossible. The dark-haired boy hit the man hard on the head, and he did not expect it at all. Fei Jai flew to the side and collapsed on the floor. Fan Xian began to approach closer. Fei Jai sighed heavily from the pain. The dark-haired boy swung a piece of heavy turquoise stone again and smashed it on the head of a gray-haired man named Fei Jai. He lost consciousness due to pain shock. Sweat was running down the young master's face. He spread his fingers on his hand and looked at them carefully. The boy's eyebrows were drawn down to the bridge of his nose. He was clearly not happy. Fan Xian thought that the man was somehow too nimble, like a snake. The boy put all his strength into his fingers, thinking that he could hold him. However, who could have known at all that he would only catch on to these racks? The boy was tormented by the question of who this gray-haired man was, who was now lying unconscious in Fan Xian's room. A dark-haired boy with a bun on his head went down to Fei Yo and put his finger on his nose. The boy frowned even more, expressing anger and dissatisfaction because he had used 100 of his energy to strike to hold blows, and this man named Fei Jai was still breathing. The boy was quite afraid that the gray-haired man would try to kill him. When he woke up, Fan Xian opened his eyes wide because he had an epiphany. He thought about why shouldn't kill Faji first in order to prevent his assassination attempt. Fan Xian took out a blade from behind the man's back and raised it over him. He took a closer look at his thick gray hair. Then the boy tightened his grip on the blade in his hand, even to the point of trembling. A cold drop of sweat ran down his face. Fan Xian froze with the blade in his hands. Considering the murder, Fan Xian ran towards some wooden building. He began to bang hard and very loudly on the large and dense wooden doors. The boy began to call Uncle Wushu very loudly. He repeated his name several times, continuing to knock very loudly on the doors. An irritated blind man with a black blindfold clocked and told Fan Xian that his store was already closed, and if the boy wanted to buy something from him, then he should come tomorrow. Fan Xian began to knock more quietly. However, he began to shout much louder to Uncle Wuju that someone had tried to kill him. A man with a black blindfold leaned against the wall, asking what this boy wanted. He assumed that the boy wanted Wuju to report the boy to the police. Fan Xian began to speak more quietly and stopped knocking on doors altogether. He informed a blind uncle named Wuju that no police were needed since the boy had killed his potential killer. The boy continued to whisper that even though that killer Fei Jai tried to kill Fan Xian, however, the young master was able to get ahead of him. The man with the black blindfold turned slightly and opened his mouth slightly. He was surprised by the boy's words and said that he was talking utter nonsense. Fan Xian whined again, calling for Uncle Wu Ju. He started banging his little fists loudly on the doors again and shouting heart-rendingly for Uncle Wu Ju to stop pretending. Fan Xian was screaming that he urgently needed help. Fan Xian continued to bang furiously and very loudly with his small fists on the wooden door of the uncle named Wu Ju. The boy screamed heart-rendingly, calling for Uncle Wu Ju. He was saying that now is not the time to pretend indifference at all. Excited boy kept knocking on the wooden door, shouting to him that a blind man in a black blindfold had been hiding in this store for years and refused Fan Xian, but now it was really very important. He shouted that Uncle Wu Ju had to take care of the boy. The wooden door suddenly opened. Fan Xian, holding his fist ready for another loud knock, frothed his mouth slightly open in surprise. Before him appeared the blind Uncle Wu Ju, whose face expressed equanimity. He looked like that. He said that the young gentleman surprised him quite a lot. After standing for an 30 seconds, Fan Xian came out of his stupor and abruptly grabbed Wu Ju's hand. Then forcing the blind man in a black blindfold to run after him, the boy shouted that they had had enough of talking and told Uncle Wu Ju to follow him quickly. Then the boy said that he would show Tom everything now. Back in Fan Xian's room, Uncle Wu Ju put 2 fingers on Fei Zhou's neck, looking for a pulse. Although the gray-haired man was unconscious, Wu Ju reported that he was still alive. Fan Xian asked in shock. Then he said that he hit the gray-haired man 12 times. He was completely perplexed as to how he was still alive. Wu Ju then said that Fei Zhai was actually there. He didn't have time to finish. Fei Zhai slowly opened his eyes, seeing that he had woken up. Fan Xian struck him with lightning speed and the man lost consciousness again. Wu Ju went on to say that in fact this white-haired man named Fei Yo was the commander of the 3rd audit chamber. That is, he was his own. The boy, holding a wooden stool in his hands, asked in shock. Having dropped the fragments of the wooden stool from his hands, Fan Xian began to emotionally question Uncle Wu Ju about why he did not tell the boy about this before. Xian smashed the stool against him, to which the imperturbable Wu Ju countered Fan Xian by saying that he did not ask him about it. Fan Xian shifted his gaze to the white-haired man. Faji was lying all bruised and foam was coming out of his mouth. The boy yelled and said that he didn't look too happy. The blind man reported that the unconscious man's name was Fei Zhai. He also said that he was one of the 3 best masters of poisons in the world. In addition, this white-haired man was good both in the production of poisons and in their application, as well as in antidotes. Fan Xian opened his mouth in shock and said that Fei Zhai is such a cool person. The boy was worried about whether Faiji would take offense at him after all these acts of self-defense. Then the imperturbable Fan Xian had handed the blade to his Uncle Wu Ju and said that the uncle should silence this man. Besides, it would be a secret that only uncle and nephew can share, to which the unperturbed Wu Ju muttered that the boy was so cruel and merciless at such a young age. He was worried about the question of who taught this kid to be like that. Wu Ju then stood up and straightened out, saying that even though Fei Zhai was subordinate to Fan Xian's father, it was not at all clear to him why the gray-haired man came here straight to Danju this time. After a few moments, Fei Zhai grimaced in pain and tried to get up to sit down. When he managed to do this, he grabbed sore head and swore in not very good words. Then he opened his eyes and saw in front of him a calm music, trembling from shock, moreover with a blade belonging to Fei Zhai in his hand. Fan Xian staring at him with his huge eyes. After a second, the boy hid the blade behind his back and began to whistle some song, pretending that he was not involved at all. After a certain period of time, Fei Zhai received medical assistance. He sat with his head wrapped in a bandage, scratching the bandages with his hand, and asked what had happened to him. Beads of sweat were running down his face. Fan Xian made the cutest expression that could ever be made, and said that Fei Yo took a sip of tea and then just fainted. Then the man with the bandage had turned a suspicious look at the boy and asked why then his head was bleeding, to which Fan Xian calmly replied that Fei Jai hit his head on the table when falling. The white-haired man chuckled and asked if Fan Xian had done his best. He laughed and began to wave his hands excitedly, saying that this was not the case, and in general, how could he have done such a thing? Then I moved closer to the boy and asked in a creepy voice, who did it if not him? Fan Xian, drenched in cold sweat, sharply pointed his finger at Uncle Wuju, saying that it was he who did it. Wuju lowered his head slightly but did not reply. Fei Jai chuckled, holding his aching head with his hand, and wondering how it all happened, he asked that apparently Fei Jai had done something very bad since their great lord Wuju decided to do such a thing. Wushu immediately replied that he didn't do it. Then he pointed his finger at Fan Xian and said that he did it. Fei Jai turned around, calmly examining the boy, who was tense with excitement. Wuju then showed 3 fingers and said that Fan Xian had done it not once but 3 times. Fiji's face turned black with anger so that only his mustache was visible, and his eyes burned with a bright red light expressing anger. Fan Xian shivered all over and began to pour cold sweat even more, as if it was raining. After a while, Fei Jai and Wuju had nice conversation. The white-haired man spoke with all seriousness that he did not think that the great lord Wuju was also in Danju. He grunted and scratched his chin. It seemed incredible to him that after so many years in the capital, Wuju had not changed at all, neither externally nor internally. Wushu then calmly inquired about what Mr. Feiyo was doing here in Danju. He spread his arms to the sides and said that the Lord had paid him a tidy sum in order for the man to become the master of Fan Xian. The boy raised his eyebrows and opened his mouth in shock, surprised that the boy's father had sent this man to him. Wuju sternly said that Fan Xian's father had not informed him about this. The gray-haired man shrugged his shoulders and said that the young master was gradually maturing, and the sooner he could start training, the more chances the boy would have in the distant and near future. Then the old man chuckled and said that it didn't matter at all what Wuzu's opinion of him was. However, if he wishes, the white-haired man named Fei Jai will return to the capital. He said that he was sure that the Lord would support him in this wishes. Man with the black blindfold chuckled and said he didn't think it was that simple. He thought there must have been another reason. Fei Jai cast a strange look from under his forehead at Wuju. Then he reported that the Lord was afraid that someone else would find the box left by Mistress Three, for Fei Jai would like to get some advice. To which Wuzu calmly replied that this was not necessary at all, since the lady destroyed this box before her death. Fei Jai breathed a sigh of relief and said that in that case everything is fine. Fan Xian at this time closed his eyes, sitting on the sofa and picking at his ear with his finger. Fei Jai reported that by the way, it always seemed to him that the young master was somehow strange, since he was only 4 years old when he asked to learn Qigong. The man asked if the boy was really not scared at all, to which Wuju said that it was really strange, that's why he didn't teach him. Wuju then turned in his heels towards the exit, finally saying that it was good now since Fan Xian now has Mr. Feij. A white-haired man thought about it. A drop of sweat trickled down his face again. He looked at the sleeping Fan Xian, whose mouth was open, and so saliva was flowing down it. Fei Jai had an ominous premonition. The next day early in the morning, Danju was illuminated by the singing of birds. The sun was shining brightly. The day should have been fine. At the morning audience, a Grandma Fan asked what had happened to Mr. Fei Jai's head. He respectfully bowed to the elderly woman, handing her red envelope with a yellow center. He reported that Master Fan assigned this Mr. Fei Jai mentors to Fan Xian, but on the way to them in Danju, a gray-haired man was attacked by some bandit. An elderly woman exclaimed in horror, and then asked if the bandit had been caught. Fei Jai convinced Granny Fan not to worry, since this bandit had already been caught. Behind Fei Jai, Fan Xian stood nervously. He didn't move from embarrassment and shame. Fei Jai slightly shifted his gaze back to Fan Xian, whose face was dripping with cold sweat. Then the man said that although this villain was cunning, but Fei Jai clearly decided to find a way to teach him a good lesson. Then the man slyly and maliciously jiggled the boy was terrified. After the conversation, Fei Jai and little Fan Xian walked down the corridor together. The maids looked at them, and immediately whispered. The blonde girl reported that the gray-haired man was the young master's new master. The red-haired girl asked again. She couldn't believe her eyes, as Fei Yo with a bandage on his head looked more like a robber. The blonde maid reported that everything was exactly like that because she knew that the elderly lady had personally received him. Then she said that he would now be their young master's mentor. A man and a child entered the pavilion under the whispers of the mates. Moments later, Fei Jai was sitting on a chair with his feet propped up on a small table. He was fanning himself with a round fan while Fan Xian was kneading his shoulders with his small fist. Fan Xian tried to convince old Fei Ji that his teacher could not blame the boy for what had happened, since teacher Fei had a knife in his hands yesterday. Besides, the boy was still young, and in his opinion that's why he acted so rashly. The white-haired man was silent, continuing to wave his fan at himself. Then, inspired by Fan Xian, he asked teacher Fei Jai about what he was going to teach the dark-haired boy. Fei Jai opened his eyes wide and looked at Fan Xian yearly. Then he said that he would teach him how to kill people with poison, and how not to be poisoned by others. Fan Xian, instead of being terribly scared, jumped up and screamed with joy. The white-haired man stopped fanning himself in surprise. There was even a cold sweat on his face. The man did not expect such a reaction from a small child at all. Fan Xian, how was too active, stretched his hand up and loudly asked teacher Fei about what they were waiting for. In this case, the boy strenuously offered the man to start classes right now. Fan Xian then asked if he could catch a couple of rats as test subjects. Fei Jai broke out in a cold sweat because of the shock. He was completely perplexed, seeing what was happening. A man with a bandage on his head wondered if this guy was really only 4 years old. Fan Xian at this time could not get enough of what interesting activities were waiting for them ahead. In the dead of night, Fei Jai holding a while Fiji was drinking something from a jug lying under a tree. Fan Xian had already dug a big enough hole. After a few moments, Fan breathed a sigh of relief. Holding the shovel tightly in his hands, sweat trickled down his face because of such physical exertion on such a small body. After examining the wooden coffin, the boy informed the master that everything was already ready. Then he asked, clarifying that now apparently it was necessary to open the coffin. Fan Xian inserted some kind of stick into the coffin, imitating a crowbar, and was almost ready to crack it. However, teacher Fei immediately appeared and stopped the boy. He asked the young gentleman if he even understood why Fei Jai had brought him here. Fan Xian, meanwhile flexing his arm, calmly replied that of course he understands everything. Then the young master said that teacher Fei had brought him here to perform an autopsy and study the structure of the human body. The boy thought it was a great first step. Faji opened his mouth in surprise. He did not understand at all how this child could know all this. Then he raised his eyebrows and asked Fan Xian if the boy wasn't a bit afraid. Before he could finish, Fan Xian broke the coffin, laid into small pieces. With one blow, the man was in severe shock. Then Xian turned around and asked the teacher about what he had said. Fei Jai cleared his throat and said he hadn't said anything. Then he handed the young gentleman a knife in order to open the body, and then to find out the cause of death of this man. The boy raised his eyebrows and slowly picked up the knife. Then he bent over the coffin, pursing his lips. Sweat was running down his forehead. Fan Xian stared at the already rotten corpse, with his mouth open, looking at the slightly sad and sweat-soaked face of young Mr. Fan. Fei began to happily poke his fingers at him, asking if the baby was finally scared. Inwardly, the gray-haired man rejoiced with joy. He was glad that this terribly brave child was finally scared. However, the boy moved away from the grave wooden coffin and spread his arms to the sides, saying that he was not afraid at all. Then the boy raised one eyebrow and said that after all, there are a lot of different microbes. Then Fan Xian said that after all, he needed some kind of protection before poking around in the body for the benefit of science. Fiji's eyes bulged in shock, and asked Fan Xian what he meant by protection. He pointed to the coffin with his hand and said that at least it was very dirty there. Then he asked about whether Teacher Fei had gloves. He immediately reported in a stern voice that the autopsy was a very delicate job. He was completely perplexed how it would be possible to wear gloves during such work. Xian immediately replied to him that he was talking about fin gloves, which were practically invisible on his hands. Fei Jai stuck out his tongue, teasing the boy. He then said that he had never heard anything about it. And also he just suggested that Sang washed his hands thoroughly afterwards. After all the arguments with Master Faith, the boy sighed heavily, holding his head. Well, apparently he had no other choice. Fei Jai was sitting on a hillock and still drinking something from a jug. Meanwhile, Fan Xian was busily digging into the coffin while performing an autopsy on the body. The white-haired man chuckled and said that since the boy was so smart, he must surely guess why Fei Jai would like to teach him how to use poisons. The boy, not at all distracted from such an important matter, replied to him that someone in any case would definitely want to kill Fan Xian in the future, so the young master needed to learn how to use poisons so that they could not poison him later. The gray-haired man looked away and said that although Mr. Wuju was not susceptible to poison, but he would not be able to protect Fan Xian from him no matter how much he wanted to. The boy turned around and asked Master Fei if he could tell the boy more about Uncle Shu. He said that Wuju was a servant of Fan Xian's mother, and he was not inferior to the four great masters in skill. Fan Xian turned around again and asked about that. Wasn't his mother very powerful? Fei sighed with admiration, saying that the boy's mother was simply incomparable. Then the young gentleman asked about how his mother died, to which man replied that he could not tell him about it, and then took another sip from his uncomplicated jug. Then a gray-haired man with a bandage on his head chuckled and asked for such a young child had so many such questions. Then he asked the boy that really he could no longer restrain himself. The boy looked at him with a long smile. Then nausea began to roll up to his mouth. He couldn't hold back any longer and vomited a rainbow of food that Fan Xian had eaten just recently. Fei Jai laughed and said that there were times when there was no longer enough urine to endure. He continued to laugh out loud while holding onto his big belly. Fan Xian withdrew near his mouth, and tears in his eyes looked contemptuously at the teacher, slightly lost in thought. Oh, this teacher! Fei Jai smiled and pointed at the boy, telling him that this was just the beginning, and then everything will only get worse. Then the man burst into loud laughter again. The next morning, Fei Jai, as if nothing had happened, was sitting on a chair drinking a drink from a jug and holding his round braided fan in his hands. Fan Xian was sitting opposite the man, also on a chair, but with his body bent down. The boy was still sick from his nocturnal adventures, the autopsy of the corpse, and the fact that he had been trying to restrain himself for a very long time. A gray-haired man with a bandage on his head handed a dark-haired boy a wooden plate with Chinese biazi dumplings. Fan Xian looked at the plate sadly. He was obviously still sick. The Tevin, a piece of food, could not get down his throat. In addition, the boy clearly did not get enough sleep due to the fact that they spent half the night at the cemetery for the autopsy of the body. There were bruises under the baby's eyes. Fei Jai smiled slightly as he handed the plate to the boy and asked him if he wasn't tired after such a night, then had told the boy to eat his bazi dumplings as soon as possible. Fan Xian pouted his lips and thought about the fact that as it turned out, this, in Xian's opinion, a nasty old man, had a kind side. The man again asked the boy about why he was looking at him like that, and again told him to eat biazi rather little. Fan Xian picked up a large dumpling that barely fit in his hand and grinned. He then turned to his teacher Fei and said they'd noticed that he was very polite to Uncle Wuju. The boy was interested in the fact that really this adult man was afraid of him. Fei Jai looked away and said that he had absolutely no reason to be afraid of Mr. Wuju, and it was just simple respect. After taking a bite of the dumpling, Xian smiled and asked the old man if Uncle Wuju wasn't a very cool person. He paused and thought, then he leaned on his arm and smiled slightly. Then he told the boy that all few warriors were divided into as many as 9 ranks. Besides, only 4 of them had a rank higher than 9th. The teacher from Nanjing has never lost a single duel in his entire life. A teacher from the Kai dynasty claimed that he was an intimate of the gods. The master from the city of Dunni said that he could protect an entire city with just one sword. The old man said that there was another such person. This man was guarding His Majesty in the palace in Nanjing. Besides, he had already saved His Majesty from assassination attempts twice. If one person had not committed a misdemeanor, then there would be 5 great masters in the world. Fan Xian's eyes lit up with a bright light, and bright stars appeared instead of pupils. Admiring Uncle Wuju, he clenched his fists. The boy did not think that his blind Uncle Wushu was so cool. Then the kid told the old man that one day Mr. Wuju gave him a book about Kai energy. Then he asked Feijai, asking him that the boy was probably very strong. He chuckled and said that the Kai energy and Fan Xian's body was really very strong. The boy got up from his chair with joy, shouting that he knew this. Then a gray-haired man with a bandage on his head poked his finger at the child and said that he was very strong, even though had not been training for so long. In addition, the amount of Kai energy greatly exceeded the capabilities of the boy's age and body. Little Fan Xian stopped and asked his teacher again. Wait, what? The kid didn't understand at all whether it was good or bad. After finishing the meal, Feijai took his disciple to the bed and said that the boy had to train his Kai energy properly. Then he asked Fan Xian to let him help with this. And first the boy had to sit up straight. The dark-haired boy folded his legs in a lotus position and put his hands palms up while closing his eyes. Fan Xian asked if he had sat down correctly. An old man named Dfeij touched the boy's small hands and told him to release the Kai energy and feel its flow inside him. He also said that Fan Xian was only 5 years old. No matter how strong his true Kai energy is, the kid will not be able to surprise Teacher Fei. He only replied with few words. Good. Fan Xian closed his eyes and concentrated. The energy of the dark-haired boy raged around with a bright golden-orange light as if fiery. The young gentleman pulled his dark eyebrows to the bridge of his nose and whispered something about the sources of energy that could not be suppressed. The fiery, bright golden energy began to rig even stronger. Fan Xian opened his eyes, and they lit up with a bright golden light. The boy's Kai energy began to flare up even brighter and rush out more quickly. The baby's body tensed. The Kai energy that was in Fan Xian's body burst out. After finishing the meditation, the boy opened his eyes and joyfully shouted to the teacher that he began to feel his energy. Then he paused for a second and gasped, realizing that Teacher Fei was no longer standing next to him. Then he saw the old man, Feijai, flying to the far corner of the room. The boy ran towards him, shouting his name. Old man Feijai slowly began to rise, rubbing his aching head with his palm. Fan Xian, agitated, shouted for his teacher not to get up because of the fault of the kid he suffered. A white-haired man covered in cold sweat was lamenting something about Fan Xian being a little. The old man did not understand at all how he could be so strong in his 5 years. Confused, Fan Xian scratched his head and smiled, saying that he also felt that he was quite capable. Then the kid giggled. Teacher Fei shouted at him with displeasure that it was not praise at all. The white-haired Feijai raised his gray eyebrows and sternly looked at the boy moving his thick mustache. He told the dark-haired boy that if Fan Xian continued to practice in the same spirit, then Feiyo was very afraid that the Kai energy of this kid would just tear Fan Xian apart. At some point, the boy looked at his teacher in horror and quietly asked again. Faji pushed his gray eyebrows to the bridge of his nose and, gritting his teeth, said that Fan Xian was like a pumpkin with wine, and his Kai energy was more. Fan Xian practiced, the more wine was poured into the gourd. Sooner or later, this pumpkin would have burst. Fan Xian raised his dark eyebrows in horror. Cold sweat rolled down his face. He was shouting, asking the gray-haired man about what he should do now in this case. Fiji scratched his chin thoughtfully. It was really bad. It was really bad. A velvety voice was heard behind the old man. He turned around in surprise and saw Mr. Wuju standing in the corner with his hands folded in front of him. Seeing Mr. Wushu, an old man named Fei Jai asked the blind man about when he came. The kid ran to his uncle named Wuzu with the words that the energy given by the man with a black blindfold to little Fan Xian was too strong. Wuju briefly replied that it wasn't him. The Kai energy that was in the boy was left to him by his late mother. Little Fan Xian smiled and asked if this energy had a name. Wuju answered briefly about what the name was. The kid immediately asked what the name was. He reported that the name of this energy was domineering and irritating Kai energy. Fan Xian took out his little finger and looked contemptuously at Uncle Wuju, telling him that the name was too stupid. In addition, it was very suitable for Ju. According to Fan Xian, old man Fei Jie laughed and said they was really worried. Then the gray-haired man turned to Master Wuju, telling him that given the strength of blind man, he would certainly be able to cope with Fan Xian's training in controlling internal energy. The kid agreed with the old man, smiling broadly. Wuju briefly replied that he couldn't do it. The old teacher and his little student froze in surprise. Then they opened their eyes wide and in unease. Unstuttered asked Uncle Wushu could hear Ollie not. The blind man calmly replied that he really couldn't teach Fan Xian. Old man Fei Jie and young Master Fan Xian raised their eyebrows and looked at Mr. Wuzu strangely. Then they raised their hands again in unison and opened their mouths, shouting loudly about what they should do. Then Fei Jie thought about it. Cold sweat was running down his face due to excitement. He was tormented by questions about how, by the way, this boy's body could contain such an impressive amount of internal energy at all. Was Fan Xian even human? The white-haired man was terrified. He thought it would be better for him not to mess with this boy. Fan Xian at this time was holding his head with his hands, terribly panicking. He was shouting that he was going to explode. Now the little gentleman was very scared. The calm Ruju reported that the boy named Fan Xian would not explode. The latter, hearing the words of his uncle, instantly froze and bulged his eyes. The old man named Fei Jie grunted and held out his hand, pointing at Mr. Wushu. He believed that Master Wuju obviously had a solution. Little Fan Xian smiled and clenched his fists, asking his uncle Wuju about what he had come up with a solution to this stalemate, to which he calmly replied that the inner energy of Kai Fan Xian could simply not be trained. Old man Fei and little Fan Xian smiled for a second, frozen. Then they looked at Mr. Wuju in horror, their eyes bulging and their mouths slightly open in shock. Just not to train energy. What? One day during the training, old man Fei Giant little Fan Xian climbed into the forest thicket. After some time wandering through the forest thicket, teacher Fei found the right mushroom. It's beautiful pink in color and with an interesting pattern. A gray-haired man, already without a bandage on his head, pointed out the fungus to his disciple Jane and told him to eat it. He smiled wearily that even cold sweat dripped from his face, stretching out his little H and stewed this pink mushroom. After eating it, little Fan Xian discovered that this mushroom was hallucinogenic. While old man Fei Jie calmly sipped his wine from a pumpkin jug, Fan Xian ran and jumped around the forest, seeing various hallucinations. The following year, under the most reliable supervision of Master Fei, little Fan Xian learned everything about poisons. He touched various mushrooms, ate them, and so on. For example, because of light brown long mushrooms with a small hat, Fan Xian skinned terribly pink furry mushrooms turned out to be hallucinogenic. Pink smooth mushrooms, if boiled, made the boy sick with their smell. And if there wasn't a poison master by Fan Xian's side, the young master would have left this world a long time ago. Returning from Theffer's thicket from another lesson, happy as an elephant, teacher Fei Giant knocked a pumpkin jug with wine on a simple wooden structure similar to a card on which he and Fan Xian were sitting, leaning again. A steel light wall, rather, only Fei Jie was leaning and the tortured Fan Xian was sitting on the edge. The gray-haired man grunted and scratched his gray mustache. telling the kid that the young gentleman had learned almost everything he could about poissons this year. The tortured child looked suspiciously at his teacher, asking him if Teacher Feiyo really called this whole nightmare a study. The boy assumed that this was the old man's revenge for what Fan Xian had done to him in the beginning. Fan Xian looked off into the distance, clenching his teeth. Cold sweat was pouring down his face. Apparently the young gentleman was still sick. In a trembling voice, he told an old man named Fei Jai that if it wasn't for his disarray to survive, Fan Xian didn't know at all how many times he would have already managed to throw away his skates. Old man Fei Jai patted the boy on the head and said that he had survived anyway, so the young gentleman should not have focused so much on the educational process. Bacao said the result was pretty good. Faji breathed a sigh of relief and smiled as he looked at the ceiling. Then he said that now, after all this, old man Fage, I could finally leave with a calm soul. Hearing the old man's words, Fan Xian raised his dark eyebrows in surprise and asked the gray-haired man about his departure. Was old man Fage already planning to return to the capital? He said with a slight sadness that he had already received the letter, and therefore in a month he returns back to the capital. The old man and the child sat in silence for a few moments, digesting the information. Then little Mr. Fan spoke up first and quietly asked about Fiji staying here for another month. Fiji rubbed his fists and made a creepy look, telling the boy that this month he must definitely take revenge on Fan Xian for what happened to the gray-haired man's head a year ago before he left for the capital. The kid opened his mouth in horror and screamed, asking his teacher that hadn't he mocked Fan Xian enough this year for the benefit of the educational process. Suddenly a strong stream of blood spurted from Fan Xian's nose. He looked at his nose in surprise and clamped his hands over it out of fear. After taking a sip of some wine from the pumpkin jug, old man Feijai told the boy to calm down, as it was a common poisoning. He also said that the excitement accelerated the spread of the toxin through the body. Fan Xian was terrified. After a while, Teacher Fei and a student named Fan Xian were standing in front of the house, conducting another creepy lesson on a small wooden table. There were various jars of poisons, plugged with corks and fabrics. The old man named Feijai folded his hands in front of him and told the little gentleman to think carefully about what kind of poison it was when it got into the boy's body, and exactly how it happened. Then he said that it was only then that the gray-haired man would be able to make sure that he could leave his disciple, the young gentleman, with a napkin in his nose. Those thawed hard, they'd even stuck out his tongue. He said that the poison had a bitter taste. From this it followed that this poison must have been mixed with medicine, so the boy did not notice its presence. The old man chuckled and told the boy then that in that case he would try to choose the right bottle. With the help of what Fan Xian had learned, the dark-haired gentleman thought about it and began to sniff all the jars with different poisons. In turn, the brown clay jar and the white bowl didn't immediately fit the smell, so Fan Xian threw them away. He also did the same with the white vial containing an unsuitable poison. Taking the round little jug, Fan Xian sniffed it and opened his eyes wide. The boy had an epiphany. He sternly pulled out the right jug of poison and firmly told his teacher Feij that it was this poison. He raised his eyebrows and told the boy in that case to drink it. Fan Xian opened his mouth wide, and small purple droplets, as if from wine, poured into his mouth. He calmly swallowed the entire contents of poison jug. At this time, the imperturbable old man Fiji picked up a bamboo umbrella and opened it. The boy looked at the teacher in surprise and said that he had guessed right. Blood began to drip from the nose of the young gentleman again, and then completely gushed out of both nostrils of the frightened Fan Xian, falling in red drops in the bamboo umbrella of an old man named Feijai. He chuckled in as if nothing had happened, said that he had told the boy to choose, but the old man did not say that there was an antidote inside these jars. Little Fan Xian was laying on the ground in horror, rolling his eyes. Cold sweat was running down his face. The tortured boy was wailing about how someone like this old man Feijai could be a teacher at all. The man came closer and looked down at the boy. Then he suggested that the boy in that case tried to poison the poison master Feij. The boy stared at his teacher in surprise and asked. Ed again he grinned and said that if Fan Xian managed to poison his teacher, then he would recognize his skills. The boy opened his eyes wide in surprise and agreed. And he made the most ingenious face, taking his teacher weakly. Well, let's see who's who. When the sun had already set below the horizon and was replaced by a crescent moon, Fei Jai sighed and sipped wine from his pumpkin jug. When he heard a knock on the door, he was surprised and looked at who'd come there at such a time. A smiling Fan Xian entered his master's chambers with a tray on which there was dinner for old man Fei Jai, a whole little chicken sauce and wine, and a white clay jug. The boy put the tray on his teacher's desk. The gray-haired man chuckled and said that the baby had been very cute lately. Did Fan Xian and really not want to say goodbye to his teacher so much? He smiled and agreed with the old man's words. Fan Xian immediately turned on his heels and waved to the white-haired man with the words that Fei Jai enjoyed his dinner, and Fan Xian would not interfere with it. At this time, old man Fei Jai opened an earthen wedge of wine and sniffed it. He immediately stopped the kid, who froze, trembling slightly. The grinning white-haired man told the young gentleman to leave the food and take the wine. The boy turned around in shock to catch the jug that his teacher threw into the young master's hands. Fan Xian asked in shock that the old man really smelled the poison in the wine. Hesmald and told the little boy to be tougher with him. Closing the door behind him, the young gentleman smiled slightly. It seems Feiji was caught on a poisonous hook. Sometime later in the afternoon, old man Fei Jai lay on the bamboo chasseau and rested, drinking wine from his pumpkin jug. Fan Xian at this time was fanning his poison teacher with his round braided fan. The old man sighed with pleasure. Suddenly a small trickle of scarlet liquid flowed from his nose. He looked at his nose in surprise. Then the red man abruptly stood, his eyes bulging. A thick red liquid was pouring out of both of the poison master's nostrils. He was clearly surprised. Fan Xian laughed very loudly as he wiped the blood from his face with the brush of his hand. Happy as an elephant, the boy poked his finger at the gray-haired man and happily told his teacher that he had lost. The student had surpassed his teacher. While he was trying to stop the blood, he began to ask the boy about what kind of poison used to win the teacher. The boy named Fan Xian smiled slightly and held up his index finger, saying that the poison used was called time. Fan Xian then told that all these days he had been feeding old man Fei Jai with the best meat and fish, which he cooked with special tonic herbs, as well as delicious soup, which this cunning boy also cooked using the same tonic herbs. Old man Fei all these days absorbed all this with pleasure, which caused the blood of the poison master to become thicker. Since eating a large amount of tonic herbs was equivalent to using poison, old man Fei Jai rubbed his forehead inside, telling his disciple Fan Xian that he was pretty smart to have found such a cunning way. The young gentleman clenched his little fists with joy and asked the old man if he could now be considered a teacher. He chuckled but was silent. A joyful Fan Xian jumped up and shouted that he had defeated his teacher in the forest thicket. Birds circled around the trees and chirped loudly. Old man Fei Jai was slowly leading his brown horse by bridle, and little Fan Xian was walking beside him. When they reached a certain place in the forest thicket, they stopped. Old man Fei Jai closed his eyes and, smiling warmly, told the young master to just stick to his way, as places and people will always change. Little Fan Xian lowered his head and said that in all these years the only person Fan Xian could trust was Uncle Wushu. The old man opened his eyes slightly and said quietly that Mr. Wushu clearly deserved it. The boy smiled and looked warmly at his teacher, telling him that now there was another such person. Fei Jai shuddered and bulged his eyes in extreme surprise. A slightly ready young gentleman named Fan Xian told teacher Fei Jai not to forget that one naughty student would always be welcome in Danju. The white-haired man looked warmly at the little gentleman and smiled, telling the boy that even if he wanted to forget, he still couldn't. Suddenly the old man remembered something and began to rummage in the pockets of his clothes. Then he held out a brown belt badge with golden patterns and hieroglyphs of the commissioner of inspection. The man said that he was asked to give this belt badge to the boy. Asked in surprise, picking up this badge after little consideration. A boy named Fan Xian said that it was very honorable. Old man Fei Jai smiled and said that Fan Xian's mother had once given this badge to them for safekeeping, so it rightfully belonged to Fan Xian. Then the dark-haired boy saw it that he also had a gift for the old man. He took out transparent gloves made of sheep intestines and handed them to the poison master, telling the gray-haired man not to forget to take them with him when he dissects corpses and experiments with all sorts of various poisons. The man immediately took the gloves from the boy's small hands and tried them on. After examining the gloves, he said that he liked them very much. Then the old man Feijai got on the horse, and Fan Xian remained standing next to him, already sitting on the horse. Feijai said that if he had met this boy earlier, Faji would have chosen a different path. He would have married someone and raised this young gentleman to be a complete. After saying these words, old man Feij set off on his brown horse. Little Fan Xian shouted to him one last time that this teacher would be able to count on Fan Xian in the future. Hearing these words, Feij shuddered in horror. In his opinion, the words of this boy sounded both cute and scary. Little Fan Xian was smiling and waving goodbye to him. After some time, Fan Xian was sitting in Mr. Wuju's shop, drinking wine. Wuju himself at this time finally chopped radish while cooking something. Fan Xian asked his uncle why he didn't drink already. All rosy and relaxed, Fan Xian told his uncle that he had bought this wine especially for him. However, since he doesn't want to drink it, this kid decided to drink it himself. Uncle Wuzu briefly replied that children should not drink alcohol. Already very drunk, Fan Xian continued to drink wine from a clay bowl, telling his uncle that actually, for his information, the boy wanted to ask you about a lot. Fan Xian then began to inundate the silent Uncle Wuju with various questions. Why has Ju's appearance not changed a bit in so many years? The boy said. The teacher face said that Uncle Wuju had no equal in martial arts, even among the four great masters. Fan Xian wondered if it was true. He also asked what kind of person his moat but was. How did Uncle Wushu have wine bowls if he doesn't drink at all? The young gentleman was very interested in who was cooler, Uncle Wuju or Teacher Feijai. Uncle Wuju was silent and did not answer any questions. After drinking enough, little Fan Xian called his uncle. He began to gradually turn off, and the wine from the bowl was pouring past. The last thing he saw before falling into a drunken sleep was the outline of the figure of Uncle Wuju, who was cooking something. After some time, the little gentleman, still drunk, woke up in a bamboo forest from the scorching sun. Standing next to him was the combat-strict Uncle Wuju. Standing up, the boy began to cough violently and very loudly. He held onto his sternum, saying that he was very ill. The boy did not understand at all what was wrong with him. Blind? Wuju calmly replied to him, saying that after Fan Xian brazenly got drunk last night, his inner Kai energy raged violently inside his little body. The boy continued to cough and sigh slowly, eating up on his wobbly legs. The boy's face was still ruddy and very drunk. Little Fan Xian raised his eyebrows and said that Uncle Wuju had given the boy that book so he should be able to control this Kai energy. Then the young and ruddy drunk asked to teach him how to control the Kai energy at him. He replied in a calm voice that he had already said that he could not teach this. Remembering this, Fan Xian shouted, asking you about what they should do now. Then Uncle Wushu reported that he had another way that could help Fan Xian. The excited kid asked the blind man what kind of method it was. He picked up a sword and with a serious face said they would beat Fan Xian. The child raised his dark eyebrows in surprise and asked what would happen next. Wuju told Fan Xian to run. He froze for a second, looking at his uncle with a strange look. Then in a panic, he grabbed his face and began to shout as if asking why Uncle Wushu and Teacher Fei were bullying him all the time. Wuju calmly met the young master that he needed to use up his internal energy as soon as possible, otherwise Fan Xian would burst, as it was said earlier. Hearing this, the young master froze in horror. Cold sweat was running down his face, and his eyes and mouth were wide open due to shock. Wuju squatted down in the right position and told Fan Xian to direct his inner Kai energy to his feet, because that's how the boy would be able to increase his speed. Then he abruptly jumped high into the sky. Coming out of his stupor, little Fan Xian gradually began to channel his golden inner Kai energy into his legs, at the same time shouting to Uncle Wuju to wait for him. When the energy reached the young master's legs, he quickly ran after the blind uncle named Wushu, the man with the black blindfold. Though blind was moving very fast, he really had no equal in martial arts. From the outside, it seemed that Wuju was floating in the air, and Fan Xian was running like a horse at a race. The boy smiled, thinking that, as it turned out, his inner Kai energy could be used in a similar way. It turns out that if Fan Xian ran for a long time, he would be able to avoid the explosion. These thoughts distracted the boy, and he lost his vigilance. Suddenly, Wuju was next to the boy and gave him a strong slap in the face. Fan Xian's cheek turned very red, and he himself landed in a cool lake, splashing the purest water around. The boy emerged from the lake holding his red sore cheek. Frightened fish were swimming around the dark-haired gentleman, and one of them was completely in the head of this obnoxious boy. Fan Xian, in shock and with tears in his eyes, rubbed his sore cheek with a small hand, shouting to the blind Wuju the question of why his uncle hit him. The latter, as always, calmly said that running alone would not be enough, but it was also necessary to have sharp eyesight and quick reactions, since it was then that others would not be able to harm Fan Xian. Cold water from the lake was flowing all over the boy's body. Hesmod slightly wiping the drops from his face, and asked Uncle Wuju about whether he really accused him that Fan Xian was not good enough. He briefly agreed. Suddenly the boy jumped out of the lake and ran through the bamboo forest again. The water wedge that had risen due to such a sudden start in the lake did not subside in any way. After standing for a few seconds, the blind Uncle Wuju, who had a black cloth bandage over his eyes, ran across the lake after the boy, leaving the same splashes of a water wedge. The fish of this lake and other inhabitants were clearly terrified. Fan Xian continued to concentrate his inner golden Kai energy in his legs, accelerating even more. Sweat from such physical exertion flowed down from the young gentleman's face. In a hail, the boy, while running, thought about the fact that, as it turned out, thanks to the concentration of his strength in his legs, Fan Xian could run faster. Running up to the end of the bamboo forest, the boy decided that if he could run out of the forest, then he could also avoid Uncle Wuju's attacks. After reaching the end, Fan Xian jumped off the cliff, taking off with the birds soaring in the sky. Thanks to the concentration of internal energy in his legs, he cast a light and sly glance back, thinking that he had run so far that his uncle named Wuju would never catch up with the young master. Now, however, it was not there. Suddenly, Wuju was behind the boy, also hovering in the air like a bird. The boy froze in horror. How did it happen at all? The blind Uncle Wuju attacked the cunning boy in the back, and he, leaving dust from himself, began to fall down. Fan Xian landed, clearly destroying the ground beneath him. A huge ball of dust remained from his landing. Uncle Wushu landed gracefully, and moreover, as in silently, Fan Xian was lying on the ground in the pose of a star and crying. Not understanding why everything turned out this way, the boy shouted very loudly to the whole forest that Teacher Fei had just left, but a new monster immediately came in his place. Besides, this monster was even worse. From the way Fan Xian landed on the ground, the entire lawn in the forest was stirred up. In addition, there was now a small pit on the bare ground. Fan Xian slowly tried to stand up while Wuju just stood next to him. Then he set conditions for the boy, which consisted in the fact that if he could hit his uncle or even touch his clothes, Fan Xian would be able to consider they had passed the test. He chuckled, rubbing his hand across his face. Fan Xian suddenly attacked his uncle, telling him that he agreed. However, Uncle Wuju had to definitely keep his word. The boy drew his eyebrows together in inspiration, concentrating his golden inner Kai energy in his small fist. He was smiling, shouting to the man with the black blindfold that he still had plenty of Kai energy. The boy also warned his uncle that he was not going to hurt him at all, but only touch his clothes. Also, suddenly a boy named Fan Xian flew into a stone, breaking a couple of adult bamboo seedlings along the way. Wuju blocked the boy's attack. With one punch with his fist, he gradually slid off the stone, leaving behind an imprinted trace the sides. Even with a face, Fan Xian didn't sit still for a long time. He abruptly grabbed the stick of broken bamboo and shouting demands to try again attacked the man again. He remained standing in place and did not even move. Fan Xian at the age of 5 could not resist Uncle Wuju and hit himself on a bamboo stick. The boy was clearly in a lot of pain. At the age of 9, the boy named Fan Xian became taller, and the bamboo stick in his hands was longer, but he was still small and not at all equal to Uncle Wushu. So far, Wuju practically didn't even need to move. He only occasionally beat his student. Fan Xian really didn't like getting slapped in the face. The cheeks were always bright red and sore. He asked his uncleaned to do that. After the young gentleman turned 13, he clearly became more confident. The dark-haired boy had grown a little taller, and he was picking up a bamboo stick longer. Even in winter when it snowed, he moved fast. Fan Xian even made Uncle Wushu move, although he couldn't even touch his clothes. The young master was already able to make a blind man in a black blindfold defend himself using his sword. The movements were fast and well honed. At the age of 16, there were practically no such obvious beatings on the young gentleman. Only small abrasions. Even when the guy received quite strong blows from his uncle named Wuju, he no longer flew into a knockout, but could adequately stop and continue the fight. A young man named Fan Xian rolled over like a sausage and hid behind a stone, holding a small stone in his hand and smiling slightly. Then he threw this little pebble to distract his blind uncle. The latter, sensing the movement, turned to this stone. Suddenly, Fan Xian tried to attack from behind, swinging a large bamboo stick that was in his hands. Fan Xian smiled slightly and uttered the phrase in his head, "Get it." However, in less than a second,